The sights, the sounds, the smells, everything about the atmosphere was inhumane and unjust. Unjust because it held an overwhelming amount of fragile criminals. Criminals with severe mental illnesses that trap them more than the bars that they are stuck behind. She heard the sound of conversation as officers wheeled a man who was strapped to a restraint chair for acting out in court back to his jail cell. And as they passed by, Roth noticed that the officers talked to this man with familiarity, as if the man had lived through the same scenario several times before. The sad reality was, he had been convicted of a crime, been sent to prison, been released from prison, and then convicted of a crime again due to his untreated mental instability. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, between 25 and 40% of mentally ill Americans will be incarcerated at some point in their lives. For mentally ill offenders, the circle of life moves them through an endless despair void of hope, until they find their place on the path unwinding, in their own personal circle of life, prison. By mentally ill offenders, I don't mean the small group of criminals who are pardoned from prison because of the insanity defense, but only wish to focus on the larger group of criminals who are found guilty but mentally ill, and are still sent to prison just like any other guilty criminal, because their illness does not meet the legal standard of insanity. Mental illness is legally defined under the Mental Health Act 1990 as a condition characterized by symptoms such as delusions, hallucinations, serious disorder of thought form, a severe disturbance of mood, or sustained or repeated irrational behavior that seriously impairs either temporarily or permanently the mental functioning of a person. Common illnesses found in the justice system are usually accompanied by a diagnosis of psychosis, a more particular and severe form of mental illness. So mental illnesses such as anxiety disorders, depression, or substance abuse may not necessarily fit the definition provided in this act. Currently, all criminals are housed in the same prisons. According to the Justice Department, about 283,000 inmates are mentally ill, which is more than 4 times the number of mental patients in hospitals. Prisons were never meant to treat, but to punish. Yet society still chooses to send the mentally ill to prisons that force them to undergo conditions that make even normal people suffer and deteriorate. Mentally ill criminals wear their illnesses on their breasts like a scarlet letter, experiencing neglect, isolation, and shame, instead of the care, treatment, and understanding that they need and deserve. Mentally ill criminals should be housed in prison facilities separate from normal criminals. Mentally ill criminals should be housed in a separate prison, because normal prison conditions not only affect them during prison, but after release as well. Normal criminals who don't struggle with mental health conditions receive the harsh punishment that they rightfully deserve when in prison. Everyone experiences a drastic change to his own personality when he spends a long period of time in prison, because no matter how bad the conditions are, he is forced to change and adapt in order to survive. According to social psychologist Craig Haney, in a report on the psychological impact of incarceration, few are left completely unchanged or unscathed by the prison experience. Susie Hulley and her colleagues at the Institute of Criminology expressed their concern for the long-term impact of incarceration on mentally ill criminals when they state, as a prisoner becomes more adapted to the conditions of confinement, he becomes more emotionally detached, socially withdrawn, and more unprepared for life after release. If prisons affect mentally stable criminals this much, they would affect mentally ill criminals so much more. The crowded living quarters, the lack of privacy, the risk of victimization, and the solitary confinements increase challenges with self-harm and adaptation to prison life among mentally ill criminals. Justin Fulp, a certified recovery peer specialist and a recovered mentally ill criminal living in Miami, recounts his experience being locked up in prison on the forgotten floor, where all mentally ill criminals were kept with conditions so bad that he reports he is still haunted by the screams of the inmates round the clock. Andre Thomas, a deeply schizophrenic 21-year-old man who was sent to death row in Livingston for killing his sister and her 2 children, spent 23 hours a day confined to a cell where he cut his throat and his wrists and threatened to kill himself because he couldn't understand why he was being imprisoned for murder if he only murdered to follow God's orders. His mental health continued to deteriorate because of poor prison conditions, until he eventually pulled his eye out and ate it. According to the National Association of Mental Illness, at least 400,000 inmates are mentally ill, a population comparatively larger than the population of the cities of New Orleans, St. Louis, and Cleveland. At least 400,000 mentally ill inmates are stuck behind bars, their mental health deteriorating with every second that passes. Others may say that prison wasn't meant to be comfortable, because prison is a place where criminals pay harsh consequences for their crimes. But just because prison wasn't meant to be uncomfortable, this doesn't mean that it has to be inhumane. Mentally ill criminals deserve to be placed in a separate facility that handles them with special care. When mentally ill criminals are incarcerated with normal criminals, their constitutional rights are violated. America is the land of the free, a land in which everyone expects justice. The Pledge of Allegiance itself ends with the iconic phrase, "with liberty and justice for all." Most Americans repeat these words with pride in order to declare a promise of equal rights. However, merely saying these words is not enough to ensure that the promise that's been made is being kept. Nelson Mandela once said, "No one truly knows a nation until one has been inside its jails. A nation should not be judged by how it treats its highest citizens, but its lowest ones." America violates the values that it has been built upon when it fails to provide a safe place for mentally ill criminals that accommodates for all of their special needs. According to Timothy F. Maloney, one of the top-rated general litigation lawyers in Maryland, prisoners claiming Eighth Amendment violations must prove that they were either deprived of the minimum civilized measure of life's necessities or are incarcerated under conditions posing a substantial risk of serious harm. All prisoners are given the right to have the bare minimum of human needs. However, basic human needs for mentally ill criminals are different compared to normal criminals. What may be seen as the bare minimum for normal criminals is inhumane for the mentally ill. If mentally ill criminals were placed in a healthier environment, these constitutional rights could be better protected. When mentally ill criminals are disrupted in prison, the most common disciplinary action enforced is solitary confinement. In the 1800s, isolation was abandoned for being barbaric. Charles Dickens himself deemed isolation as worse than any torment of the body. Solitary confinement has revisited society, severely harming the people that it holds. According to University of California, Irvine School of Law professor Karen Ryder, more than 400,000 prisoners experience solitary confinement per year. 33 to 50% of those prisoners suffer from a serious mental illness. Judith Resnick, a law professor at Yale, sheds light on the consequences of placing mentally ill criminals in solitary confinement when she says, "Solitary confinement is a disabling setting that is harmful for human health and safety. It can do harm for people who are mentally okay and inflict terrible damage on people who are mentally ill." Like I said earlier, if we separate mentally ill criminals from normal criminals, their constitutional rights could be better protected. Yes, prison wasn't meant to be comfortable, but this doesn't justify the deprivation of someone's human needs. Mentally ill criminals deserve for their constitutional rights to be protected, and housing them in the same prisons as normal criminals is simply not doing so. Housing mentally ill criminals with normal criminals defeats the purpose of incarceration. When the prison system was first established, its primary goal was to punish, deter, and isolate criminals from the public in order to reduce risk to public safety. However, as the prison system continued to grow and evolve, new ideas of prison reform and rehabilitation emerged, and as a result, the prison system also became known as the correctional system. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 10, Number 3 states that the penitentiary system should make prisoner reformation and social rehabilitation into an essential aim. Although the prison system has evolved into a system that not only strives to punish, but also to rehabilitate, it is only achieving the goal of punishment. To be clear, I'm not arguing that mentally ill criminals should not be punished, but I am arguing that prison should also embrace the other extreme and totally disregard the prisoner's rehabilitation. Mentally ill criminals deserve to be treated with special care compared to normal criminals. This can be seen in Milton's Paradise Lost. God practices more compassion and understanding on Adam and Eve compared to the angels, because humans were less capable than the angels were. Potentially, they could have been as capable, but they just hadn't reached the angels' level yet. God himself recognizes the differences, so we should as well. Mentally ill criminals have the potential to be mentally stable, But without society's understanding and compassion, they simply cannot be. Placing mentally ill criminals in a safer environment is a team effort. According to Krista Gertson, a federal prison psychiatrist, if there is a reluctance to recognize shared responsibilities between the mental health and criminal justice systems, important treatment opportunities are lost. Successful programs usually have formal coordination between mental health officials, police, and the courts. If society only recognized the need that mentally ill criminals need, they would be able to separate mentally ill criminals from normal criminals into a facility that not only punishes them, but also rehabilitates them. Mentally ill criminals are distinctly different from normal criminals, and they deserve to be treated with special care. Some people may say that separating mentally ill criminals into a separate facility that is more suitable towards them absolves them of accountability. After all, America punishes mentally ill criminals for their crimes and not for their mental illnesses. Although normal criminals and mentally ill criminals have distinct differences, they have one underlying similarity that simply cannot be ignored. They have both committed crimes and deserve to be punished. Although the Israelites were God's people, He refused to grant them immediate access to the Promised Land because they were still accountable for their sins. Mentally ill criminals should not be given a free pass into their own Promised Land. Man's responsibility for criminal justice is a central idea to Judeo-Christian civilization. God is a just God. God is an even-handed God. God is a retributive God. From the flood to the plague to the seemingly endless days of wandering, God practices justice by punishing His people for their sins. Genesis 9:6, in particular, emphasizes God's retributive nature when He declares, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed." Notice that the first word alone communicates who the law holds accountable. All man is subject to the law. Leviticus 4:22 takes this point even further. You shall have one standard for man and stranger alike. For I, the Lord, am your God. The law is the law, a standard that simply cannot be compromised. And because mentally ill criminals have broken this standard, they must pay the harsh consequences and carry their own crosses. However, Christ has fulfilled the old with the new. Although God is a just God, He is also a compassionate God. And His dual nature presents itself in everything, especially in His law. Though He floods the whole earth, He paints a picture of a rainbow in the sky as a promise of His love. Though He sends devastating plagues to Egypt, He protects His people with lamb's blood, foreshadowing the blood of the lamb that He would later paint on the doors of His people's hearts. Though He denies the Israelites access to the promised land, He eventually fulfills His promise as His people set foot on the soil that their compassionate God promised to them. I'm not arguing that mentally ill criminals should be punished, because to argue such a thing would be against biblical teaching. I am, however, arguing that mentally ill criminals deserve to be shown the same compassion that God shows His own people. Mentally ill criminals are distinctly different from normal criminals, and God Himself recognizes these distinct differences and considers them. So as a society, we should as well. Though this does not remove them of their accountability, it does constitute society's special compassion and understanding towards them. Some people may say that it is not the legal system's job to accommodate for mental illnesses. Prison was never meant to treat people. As stated earlier, prison was meant to punish, so it should not have to accommodate or adjust for a medical problem that it was never meant to address or treat. It is the prison's job to punish, and that is where its duty should end. According to Donna Lyons, an assistant professor at Trinity College, Dublin, government has a responsibility to help those who cannot help themselves, and I am a believer in changing systems to make that happen. From eradicating slavery to giving all women equal rights, the government has always fought for those who could not fight for themselves. The real question here is, why that same government that fought for the eradication of slavery, that fought for women's equal rights, cannot fight for the mentally ill deteriorating in prison every single day. The second commandment says, love your neighbor as yourself. this issue is just as much a moral issue as it is a legal issue. Society fails to realize that when considering mentally ill criminals, we cannot replace basic human values with blind judgment and harsh punishment. Jesus himself shows unfortunate people love and compassion. When a man possessed by a demon in the book of Mark approached Jesus, Jesus cast out the demon before punishing the man blindly. He took care of the problem at hand first before punishing the man without understanding. As humans, and especially as Christians, we are called to love those who are less fortunate than us. Because without love and compassion from humans, any man would go insane. This idea of needing human connection in order to be mentally healthy can be seen throughout literature as well. Hemingway illustrates a man who goes insane when he is alone at sea. Bradbury illustrates a world in which a fireman loses his mind when he does not have human connection and individuality. Let's not forget about Dr. Manette, who was only recalled to life when he was surrounded by the love and compassion of his daughter Lucy, who understood that in order to be mentally healthy, he needed that special love and compassion. If society only understood the special need that mentally ill criminals have and the special care that they require, there would be less mentally ill criminals behind bars deteriorating without any treatment at all, and more mentally ill criminals receiving treatment, compassion, and love that they need in order to be mentally stable. Journalist Alyssa Roth felt chills go up her spine as she quietly took in her surroundings. The sights, the sounds, the smells. Is this what 400,000 prisoners have to go through every day? The sad reality is that these poor prison conditions are part of day-to-day life for mentally ill criminals, and there is absolutely nothing that they can do about it. I'm not completely sure that if we separate mentally ill criminals from normal criminals, that this whole issue would be solved. But I do believe that a bold action must be enforced in order for us to get closer to the goal that we as a society wish to reach. And that is providing a prison situation for mentally ill criminals that ensures their protection and that does not deprive them of their human rights. Compared to normal criminals, mentally ill criminals are fragile, mentally unstable, neglected, hopeless, helpless, and desperate for help. If we strive to provide a better prison situation for mentally ill criminals, we may possibly succeed. But if we don't, we will definitely fail. Journalist Alyssa Roth felt chills go up her spine as she quietly took in her surroundings. The sights, the sounds, the smells. Mentally ill criminals, they deserve so much more than this.
I have a question. If you could clarify exactly what your proposal is. Is it to build additional separate facilities? Is it to move them all to one location? And is the emphasis on treating and curing? What exactly is this going to look like?
I'm proposing, so right now, like I said, all criminals are housed in the same prisons. So all criminals are treated normally, just like normal criminals would be. And so I'm proposing that mentally ill criminals should be placed in a separate prison facility that is still a prison, but that has different conditions and guards and mental health officials that could treat them. So it's not really an emphasis of anything in particular, it's more of a balance. Because right now I'm advocating, or I believe, that prisons right now have tend toward punishment more. So I'm just arguing for a better balance between rehabilitation and punishment. That's his question.
Yeah, thank you, Abbey, for your compassion for the mentally ill. One question is, as I understand it, there is the concept of insane asylums and hospitals for the mentally ill today, and it sounds like that's what you're describing as an alternate solution. And so I'm curious, why aren't those being used more, or are they working? What what does the data show on the existing solutions?
So, for mentally ill criminals, insane asylums are different, obviously, because they are for mentally ill people, not really mentally ill criminals. And prisons are different because they're for all criminals, and mentally ill criminals are sent here. Insane asylums, I understand that they are another solution, but they are different in that the conditions are so bad that they aren't effective. And this can be seen through how many mentally ill criminals are being sent to prison. Because usually when people are sent out of insane asylums, they go out into the streets and they tend to commit crimes and become disruptive because their mental illnesses haven't been treated sufficiently, even if they were from insane asylums. So that's why they're sent to prisons. And yeah, so what I'm advocating for is a different facility that's not entirely like an insane asylum, but that is a prison facility that is specialized for mentally ill criminals, because right now they don't really have a facility for themselves. And I read an article that even claims that psychiatric hospitals and insane asylums are the prisons are the de facto psychiatric facilities and insane asylums, because there are more mentally ill criminals in prisons than there are in insane asylums and psychiatric hospitals right now.
That was a nice presentation, Abby. In your research, did you find any examples of the system that you're proposing? If so, your success?
I haven't found any examples because from my knowledge, from my research, no one's really done this before. But I have found steps that could lead to that. Like for example, right now they have mental health courts. And these aren't too common, but they're becoming a little more common. And they aren't exactly what I'm proposing, but they are making life a little better for mentally ill criminals, just not enough. So mental health courts are usually courts specialized for mentally ill criminals or mentally ill people. And there's a different system to how the trial works for mental health courts. But other than that, there are no solutions that I actually have encountered that are anything like what I'm proposing.
Abby, is this more is there more philosophical opposition to your ideas, or is there more practical opposition? Philosophical, I mean, use of mentally ill, and practical, and thinking more cost.
I honestly cannot make a direct, there is more of this than that. I can say though that there is opposition from both sides from what I've seen. Like, for example, philosophically, society sees mental illness negatively at this point. In a part of my paper I talk about criminalizing mental illness. And so philosophically, how society sees mental illness, yes, there may be opposition, because right now society doesn't see mental illness as primarily a medical problem, but sees it as something that's more of a moral failure, like I mentioned earlier. And practically, yes, there may be opposition because of the economy and costs of incarcerating mentally ill criminals in a different prison facility, because obviously that would take a lot of money to have more prison facilities just for mentally ill criminals. But as for right now, I'm not quite sure if there's more for one or the other, but there are different oppositions.
And a quick follow-up to Dr. Half's question. Have other countries dealt with this differently? Have you seen any research in other countries about it dealt with mentally ill people in a very different way than normally incarcerated folks?
Because I was only focusing on American prisons and the American legal system, no, I have not. I didn't research about it, but I did run across some statistics of other countries who deal with their mentally ill criminals better. I just haven't looked into how they do that.
Abby, have you thought about other prison arrangements that might be at least analogous? For example, in Monroe, there is a prison for special offenders, which is basically sex offenders, and they're isolated and treated differently from other prisoners and kept in a different place. Have you thought any of the analogous transferring that sort of experience to the mentally ill?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that actually is very similar to what I'm talking about, but with mentally ill criminals. And so one of my main points I'm trying to get across is if we can do this for other criminals, like coming up with sex offender prison facilities, or helping people with physical illnesses and separating them, why we can't do it for mentally ill criminals. And so it's the same kind of idea where they can be sent to a separate prison facility that may not have to be as big, but still a separate prison facility where they're treated differently.
So following up on that question, maybe around the idea of why separate facility would be the best solution. You talked about how the journalist was in a place where she heard many, hundreds of mentally ill inmates screaming and crying in anguish, and you described other stories of a mentally ill person, upset and ripping his eye out. I mean, if you were to group all the mentally ill people in the same place, wouldn't that scene still be the same? I mean, I'm picturing Batman and Arkham Asylum and mayhem in the streets. How is that a better picture?
With the idea of placing them in a separate facility. So my whole point with how bad prison conditions are, they're that bad because normal prisoners are in there too. And so the whole idea is it would be different because if they were placed in a separate facility, it'd be a totally separate environment with a totally different mindset towards them. And so, I read an article about how in prison guards see mentally ill criminals as a disturbance or a bother, obviously because they are more disruptive. But if you put them in a separate facility with people who are actually more specialized in helping them, I think that their disruptiveness and their behavior and the screams of anguish wouldn't be as escalated because they'd be a separate environment that is specifically made for them.
So Abby, in your paper, you say that a mentally ill criminal may not understand a command, may be meaningless to him because he's not capable of understanding the repercussions of disobeying. Do you believe mentally ill people are capable of understanding that their crimes are capable of consequences?
Okay, so I should have clarified that. So when I say that they're not capable of understanding what they did wrong, I mean they're less mentally capable of truly understanding, oh, if I do this, then I'll be punished to this extent. And obviously there are some mental illness symptoms that they can't control and that prison guards could see as disruptive. But I believe that for the mentally ill criminal group that I'm talking about right now, not the people who experience insanity offense, they do understand why they did the crime, which is why I don't advocate for them not having accountability. Because if they didn't understand why they committed the crime, they would be sent to a mental hospital and would have been given a pardon because of insanity offense. So.
I'm wondering if creating prisons for mentally ill is a little bit of a dangerous precedent to set. You mentioned they're a special group. Are there other special groups that may then lobby for different incarceration facilities? I'm thinking, we live in a crazy world. I'm thinking, are there now going to be a cause for transgender prisons? You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
What's the next special group that's going to demand a special prison because of their special need?
I'm not quite sure what next special group would say, oh, we need another prison facility, because obviously this is a hypothetical situation. But in this paper, it is understood that mental illness is different than, let's say, special needs, as in, you mentioned transgender. Unless you can say transgender is a mental illness, which is a totally different topic, I don't want to address, then I think that because of the differences of it's medical this time, like it's an actual condition, an illness, I think it's different compared to these different groups that have formed due to our crazy society.
I have a question for you about the whole argument about solitary confinement. And, you make a very good case for how it would drive anyone around the end. But I'm wondering how we balance that with, for instance, you stated that mentally ill are much more violent. You say 2 to 8 times more violent in your paper, for instance. You cite instances of them being more disruptive to guards. So is solitary confinement ever a valid punishment for them, or say you would never use it?
I think solitary confinement to a certain extent could be. I believe that solitary confinement, as it is right now with the conditions that it has right now, is not. And I believe that it's inhumane and unusual with how they use it right now. But I believe that separating mentally ill criminals in a place, well, separating anyone in a place and call it solitary confinement with conditions that are more humane. Like, for example, if they're put in solitary confinement and have hours where they can go out and take a break and still interact, then that would be an okay way to enforce solitary confinement. But as of right now, solitary confinement conditions are definitely inhumane because they, I mentioned in my paper, they receive little to no food, the bare minimum of human needs, basically. So this is extremely detrimental to mentally ill criminals in prison.
I think I recall you made the point that mentally ill prisoners still deserve punishment for their crimes. What types of punishment do you think are suitable besides just confinement in prison?
Well, when you're in prison, the punishment is prison, it's confinement. So when I say they still need to be punished, I mean they shouldn't be placed in a separate facility that's completely comfortable, is what I mean. When they're placed in a separate facility, they should be placed in a separate facility that is still, to a certain extent, I want to use the word carefully, cruel, but not cruel to the point that it is inhumane for them.
Your argument is in part that they should be in a completely separate facility. Have you thought at all about different treatment, but in the same facility?
Actually, currently, like I said, I cited Justin Wolf in my paper, and he was housed on the forgotten floor, where all the mentally ill criminals were kept. So there are prison facilities where mentally ill criminals have their own floor, but I believe that they should be placed in a separate facility because even if you have your own floor, it is still the same environment, it's still the same building, it's still the same people who take care of you. So if they're in a separate facility, they would have a completely fresh, different, healthier environment. Because even though they were on the forgotten floor, even though they were on a different floor, he could still hear the screams of the inmates. So, I mean, it's still the same environment, same conditions. I guess mentally ill criminals were just separated. And I could say that it's probably because they were separated because they were a danger. So.
Follow up on that one. So is what you're saying, and you mentioned the team that's necessary and so forth, so it sounds like what you're saying is if they were just on a different floor, that you still have the people that are running it who are not trained to handle it. So
Yes.
you're wanting a special team who's trained for their special needs.
Yes.
You mentioned that I think throughout the course of U.S. history that prisons have taken on a more corrective or a goal to be penitentiaries and to correct people or to reform. Is that something that's an official mandate and charter on prison facilities, or is it something less than that?
Well, it's more of an idea that society has taken up because, well, I mean, for example, with the Eighth Amendment, the Constitution, usually, so the Supreme Court said that these laws are usually enforced because of what society sees as human decency. And so it's not, I don't believe that it's necessarily a legal thing that is enforced on prison facilities, but I do believe that it's a standard that has been kind of evolved as the time has gone on.
So would you say that prisons are not currently in violation of any written laws?
I can say that, I mean, for normal criminals, for all prison population, no. But because I'm focusing on mentally ill criminals, for mentally ill criminals, I believe that they do violate the Eighth Amendment, which forbids the infliction of cruel and unusual punishment.
Do you know if any prisons have ever been charged on, in criminal cases, somebody bring the charges that you brought against them into the law?
There has been a complaint by someone named Larry Grant Bowring, who he was sent to prison and he advocated in court if he could have parole from prison, which is totally different than what I'm arguing for, but same kind of idea. He asked the Supreme Court if he could have parole from prison because he wasn't receiving mental health care in prison and because he wasn't able to go through the prison conditions that were so detrimental, and the Supreme Court denied his request. So there have been several trials in which prisoners try to bring up the argument, but not in all trials it's granted to them.
Judges, do you feel you've asked enough questions?
Trying to phrase this succinctly. You mentioned our society fights for the rights of the underdog, in essence.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned freeing slaves and rights of women. Those are rights which, in essence, are equal before the bar. These people are pleading to be treated the same as everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
New prisons require something different. They require society to not just grant rights, but to give up their resources. Mm-hmm. So, have you thought about that? Do you think our society demands that we give up our, come to my house, demand of me, my resources to benefit someone else?
Well, like you said earlier, that eradicating slave rights, and also women's rights, they're all advocating to be treated the same way as everyone else. And so when I say that mentally ill criminals should have their rights, granted, I mean that they shouldn't be treated like everyone else in the sense that they should be treated as. But I'm advocating that as humans, they should be treated right. And so pertaining to your question about resources, I believe that it's all humans are given a moral standard by God. And so I believe that as humans, and especially as Christians, we have this, not duty, but we have an innate kind of longing to help other people. And that can be seen through how others help others. And so when I advocate for their human rights, I advocate that these people are humans, and as fellow humans, we should help them as well.
So is there a difference between doing that as individual Christians commanded by God, and government, which uses force on the unwilling to provide that same service?
Sorry, can you restate your question?
Sorry, okay. So as individual Christians, you've argued we should do this because God commands it.
Yes.
Does that mean the government should do it? Which necessarily means they do it by force. Sometimes unwilling people.
The government should enforce that. Well, when I say that mentally ill criminals should be separated in a separate prison facility, I'm not really arguing that society, focused on society where they should, I'm going to give up my resources for these people. It's more of a government duty. Like I hope for the legal system to enforce this system. Because obviously if it's just society, if it's just people, it won't really be able to happen in the way that we want it to. So on a large scale, I believe that the legal system should. Well, I mean, I know they're not, all of them, well, for people who are not believers, They aren't necessarily commanded by God because they don't believe in God. But the government has a responsibility to help the people under it. And so I think that's what the driving motivation should be.